very much, and let me echo the sentiments of my colleagues and fellow GIC members when I say we're very happy to be here. Thank you for all the hospitality. So we are going to pivot to the global economic outlook, and we are going to do this in several parts. We have a distinguished panel. We have Therese Turner-Jones, the General Manager of the Caribbean Group of the Inter-American Development Bank. And sitting here with me is Leland Miller, the CEO of the China Beige Book. So virtually, I'd like to turn the call over to Therese first to get us started. And maybe as a first question, if we could go to the virtual session and discuss the local economy, how you're viewing it and what the outlook might be.
Thank you, Don. Guys hearing me?
Yes.
I just need to make one correction. I'm no longer the general manager of the Caribbean Department at IDB. I am now the project director at the Caribbean Development Bank, so I'm in Barbados. I'm very jealous to be here and not there in the room with you, especially since I'm hearing some familiar voices that I recognize. I particularly enjoyed John's presentation just now because I think to Shivago's point, it's not that money makes the world go round, but it's how we can transact business that really makes the world go round. So I'm really proud that the Bahamian Dollar is one of the first movers in the CBDC world. It's been recognized for that. We need to promote its adoption and more generalized use. And I'm just really proud of that work. So I just want to put that on record. And his points about the payment system are right on, because I just came out of a conversation yesterday with Apex Bank, who are thinking about working with CDB to help promote another payment system so that countries that can de-risk all the reasons we are very familiar with in this region, we can find some way to transact business faster and more modern way, more efficient, and of course, the topic of this panel is global economic outlook and where we headed. And what's great is that we have the benefit of the IMF just having completed an Article 4 consultation in the Bahamas. So that information, I hope all of you in the room are already familiar with, but I'll make a couple of references to that too, just to localize it. But my time is kind of short in terms of what I'm going to lead with, and I just want to point out a few things based on the regional economic outlook for Latin America and the Caribbean and where we are today in February of 2024, which sounds like a really scary time in terms of how fast time is going. But what we see and what not just we see, but institutions like the IMF who do most of the following of what's happening in the global economy, of course, is that there is a steady recovery happening, particularly post the pandemic. But what's likely to happen in 2024 is those big growth numbers we saw in 2023, including, for example, for the Bahamas, which recorded double-digit real GDP growth of over 14% last year. That is going to taper off this year. Of course, last year being 2023, coming out of 2022, which is really sort of the last bit of the COVID pandemic taking effect, we expected to see a big, and because the Bahamian economy is so tied into the tourism industry, we know, given the buoyancy of that sector in the Bahamas, that number is pretty extraordinary. And it's very impressive to me that those numbers continue to be extraordinary for the Bahamas tourism. We're seeing that all over the Caribbean. But what's going to happen for the rest of this year is probably more a reversion to mean. And what I mean by that is that countries are going to tend to go back to where they were, say, 2019 or even before that. And I think that's, if there are any risks, it's what's going to happen as things decelerate a little bit, what implications that's going to have for unemployment. Also saw in the Bahamas, for example, unemployment is now under 9%. Thank goodness for that. And in other countries, unemployment is coming down pretty fast. And I want to say that for this region, if we end up talking about policy at any point, I think the labor market is one we need to focus on because in my view, and looking at the data on productivity, we need to do a lot of work around improving the skills of the labor force, but we'll get back to that. What's driving what's driving the economic recovery now, I think, is partly lower commodity prices, although we're starting to see that changing a little bit. If I look across our region, which is, not just tourism dependent economies, but they're also heavily commodity dependent economies, Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, especially. Guyana's a newcomer to the oil and gas business. But CDB, for example, takes a look at the average growth rate for the region, including Guyana, and that number pops up to some very large number. When we take Guyana out, because Guyana's been growing by over 50% since they discovered oil and gas, that is even tapering off. But we're seeing a tapering off of growth in the region. So that's what I mean by reversion to mean. But I think the good news is that our main trading partners, the US, Canada, Europe, all of those numbers that are coming in for those economies are pretty optimistic, although even the IMF expects a lot of tapering off. And that tapering off has to do with the still impact of inflation that's mitigating a faster growth trajectory in our major trading partners. And that's worth keeping in mind, especially as we have some geopolitical forces that are at play that haven't really gone away. And, Ukraine conflict is one that we've heard a lot about, but now we also have the interruption of shipping routes because of the terrorism that's happening in that part of the world that I can never quite remember how we refer to it. But I think you all know what I mean. And that's causing disruptions again in the supply chain, exacerbating the already supply chain issues related to wheat coming out of Ukraine and other issues related to that conflict. And so we're seeing that, that's one of the flags, the red flags that we need to watch. In terms of the region and the buoyancy we see coming through tourism and then coming through the commodity sector, we anticipate, of course, that that's going to augur well for the Caribbean. And I think the Bahamas is no exception. Again, what are the things we need to be watching out for? I mentioned inflation already. I mentioned the geopolitical issues. I mentioned labor market constraints that could be a drag on how fast we grow because the labor is just not there to do the things that need to be done. And say a big economy like Jamaica is facing this lowest level of unemployment ever and that's affecting how fast that economy can grow, and that's affecting regional outlook. On the risk side, and this is really important for this audience, because we're seeing, obviously this region, we cannot talk about economic performance, economic outlook without talking a little bit about the impact of climate change and what's that doing to the long-term prospects for sustainability for the Caribbean. For the Bahamas, post-Dorian, the impact of, the budgetary impact of Dorian, the devastation in Grand Bahama and in Abaco of Dorian, the potential of another Dorian in the coming years is always looming, I think, and weighing on the policymakers in the country. But this is a threat that is not going away given where the world is on fossil fuels. And despite all the exhortations coming out of COP28 about everybody around the world reducing fossil fuel use, even the policies in the Caribbean and in the Bahamas in particular, I think need to be more focused around how complicated this threat is. It's not just about meeting a renewable energy target, and I think in the Bahamas it's something like 30% by 2030. But if we're not anywhere near that what we're doing is, while we contribute very little to greenhouse gas emissions globally, it's the signal that we're sending to investors, sending to consumers about changing behavior. And just like what John was trying to say about the use of digital wallets and different types of payment system to make things easier, we need to start embedding in the minds of everyone, all children, all of us. We need to be conscious of what we're doing, the kinds of fuels we're using, why we're doing things in a particular way. Is there another way to air condition our homes without having to rely on electricity coming from BPL, for example? Should we be having more solar panels, more PVs around the country to generate another energy source? It's all about, sort of changing behaviors over time so that it's not so much that in the Bahamas we're going to be able to change the trajectory of fossil fuel use in the world, but I think it's about changing the way we think about our relationship with nature and what it's doing to the planet. And I think we all have responsibility for that. So I just want to put that out there. And I'm conscious of the time, so I know Shivago is a really good timekeeper, and he'll tell me when my 7 minutes is up. But on, if if we drill a little bit, and I want to say this because I think it's really important, because I've been an observer of the public financial management of the Bahamas over many decades. And as an economist and someone who cares deeply about development challenges in this region, it really is a red flag when we don't have balanced budgets. And I'm not going to get into any details around who's responsible for whatever contribution to the debt scenario that we currently face, but what happens in countries with debt to GDP ratios over a certain threshold, and it's well established that for small countries like ours, anything over 60% should send a red flag to everybody. It certainly sends a red flag to our credit rating agencies. It sends a red flags to investors coming to the country. But more importantly, it sends a red flags to taxpayers, because it means that I'm expecting that at any moment to reduce that deficit, it means the deficit and the debt, it means that I'm going to have to pay more out of my disposable income to the government. So, and I know because our entire population has been brought up on no taxes or minimal taxes, that is a concern. So I just want to put it out there that while fiscal discipline always seems to come as if it's a bad kind of, IMF will tell us to do this and IMF will tell us to do that. It's not about what the IMF is telling us what to do. It's about what we know after decades of researching what happens to economies when you get into a debt spiral, how important it is to, one, observe fiscal responsibility rules and laws and try to educate the public too about why it's important that we live within our means. And by that, of course, I'm not saying don't borrow for infrastructure or don't borrow for important big projects that's going to have major economic impact on the economy and the welfare of Bahamians. But I think the point is, let's be very careful about what we borrow for, how we borrow for it, on the terms we borrow for. So exhaust all of the options through our concessionary partners, IDB, World Bank, CDB, for example, as the Bahamas has started to do. It's really important that we get that mix right, because we're paying a lot when we have to go to commercial borrowers. We can pay a lot less if we use access to the concessional financing. And by the way, IMF has a really good, important instrument called the Climate Resilience Fund, RSF, Resilience Sustainability Fund, which is particularly designed to help countries like the Bahamas deal with the climate finance issues and action issues that we need to do to put the country on a more sustainable trajectory. There's no bad news when you access that fund. It's all good news. The upside with the credit rating agencies is that this is a good move. We should do it. We should take advantage of those resources because we need it. Um, Again, looking at the clock, what I want to say on the inflation front is while this week there was good news coming out of the U.S. about prices moderating a lot. Of course, it takes a while before we start to feel those effects. Since 2022, Bahamas inflation has been coming down very nicely. It's important that we stay within, that 2 to 3% range. That's something that I think immediately puts resources back in the pockets of consumers. And if we can manage that in a way that especially vulnerable groups have access to resources that ordinarily they couldn't because we're managing inflation better, I think that would really be great. If I were to just say two last things where I think we can make a huge impact in terms of the efficiency of the economy is on the role of digitalization. And this is where, to pick up on John's point on digital payments, we know that countries that move in this direction not only are more efficient, but they're able to reduce transaction costs. So, for example, when the UK introduced more public services on a digital platform, they were able to reduce, let's say, the cost of a particular transaction from something like, um, you know, $10 to 50 cents. That's the kind of impact. That's the bang for the buck when we can deliver services digitally. And I think Bahamians have already experienced the advantage of using the national ID card to renew a passport online or to get a driver's license online. They understand what a great benefit that is. And I think if we try to position the Bahamian economy in a way that is more modern, more use of the platforms, that is also a very what I would say a shortcut to improving some of our doing business indicators. Somebody mentioned red tape some time ago, but we need to be able to deliver our services more efficiently and more quickly. And of course, the point on expense is that for the government, there's savings to be accrued. If I were to point out where I think there is lots of room for improvement, not just in the Bahamian economy, but as I look at the region at large, we need more work on this aspect of digitalization, more in education because the skills aren't there. We need to improve labor productivity. Healthcare is something that, because the pandemic showed up a lot of structural inefficiencies in the way we deliver healthcare. There's a whole body of new ways of delivering health now through telemedicine and so on. Some doctors did that very successfully through COVID, but this could be a new way of getting those patients, for example, who live in the Family Islands, access to better healthcare on a regular basis to manage their NCDs, which, as everybody in the room must know, it's the biggest killer of not only a certain population, but across our region, NCDs, lifestyle related diseases associated with alcohol use, tobacco use, and obviously cancer would go in there, but cardiovascular diseases, diabetes, these things can be better controlled if people had better and quicker and more efficient access to good primary health care. And on our infrastructure needs, there are plenty of gaps in this region. In the Bahamas, I think our infrastructure on average is pretty good, but we know that there's still room for improvement, particularly in the Family Islands. And the question is, how is that financed? And I would link to that, of course, the whole move to renewable energy, because electricity cost is one of the most expensive in the region. It affects every single price in the country. It affects whether someone can manufacture something at a reasonable price. It affects the cost of our tourism product. And it needs to be more reliable. We know about outages and so on. But all of this to me suggests that there's room for opportunities in the private sector, in the renewable energy side, but also allowing room for public-private partnerships to come in to deliver energy at a cheaper price to more Bahamians. I think that's all I want to say as my opening inning all round. And I'm sure I'll get questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Therese. Maybe as a first question and a follow-up to what you mentioned on
Inflation, it's obviously been a concern in many countries. Would there be a first policy choice that you would recommend if inflation returns? Is there something that policymakers in the Bahamas could use to cushion its impact on consumers or vulnerable groups quickly?
Targeted transfers. So you can't do things like reduce or zero rate all the items, right? Because government needs revenue in order to pay for these transfers. But if we know that there are poorer segments of our society, they can be targeted to get support. Second, we need to look at, are there any policies that are actually causing prices to be higher in general? So think about issues around how our retail and distributive trade is organized. We have not that many players. So what is the nature of all the monopolies and how they operate in the economy that can change? Doing deals with some of these companies to say, hold on, these breadbasket items that need to reach everybody in the economy, is there another way? How can we help cushion the rising costs for these items? There are a number of things that I think countries can do, but on policies, if I had a long discussion yesterday about Jamaica and their chicken production. How do we say when chickens are being chicken farming? The agricultural policies related to the production of chicken, and how that is actually working against the average person being able to afford chicken in the country, because the sector is protected. When we know that if chicken were allowed to be imported zero rated, average person in Jamaica could have access to protein at a cheaper price. So there are issues like that I think our policymakers need to be aware of. When those policies were put in place, I don't know how many years ago or decades ago, there may have been cause for that particular industry to be supported at that point. But now, fast forward several decades, is it still necessary that we're supporting an industry that may be inefficient and actually working counter to the consumer's interests? So, and some of those things may actually be at play in the Bahamian economy, but I think it's left to those who are closer to the data to decide which ones there are. It could be that we're supporting some inefficiencies and we need to get rid of those. But in the first instance, I would say target support to extremely vulnerable groups. And on that, paying attention to what our safety net provides, right? The Bahamas has been recognized over a long period as being one of the wealthiest countries in the Caribbean. But we know that within our population, there are demographics and quintiles where people are actually going maybe not completely without a meal a day, but we know that there are people who are hurting in our society. We need to take account of that, figure out who they are, and target assistance to them. So that would be my response. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Maybe we can pivot from the local to the global picture.
Ask Leland to weigh in here. Maybe we could do it in the context, since we were talking about policies and politics, here in the context of geopolitics and what you're seeing, how that might relate to the local or global picture.
Sure. When we talk about a global economic outlook, I usually refrain from bringing in the geopolitics, because so much of what we see is typically episodic. A lot of people thought that was what the Ukraine war was. You're seeing what's happening in the Red Sea. It's sort of seen as short-term things to navigate among a broader economic trajectory. But I think things are different now, because I think that there's a broader structural narrative that is actually playing out that we need to be very aware of, particularly getting into the mind of the American perspective. If you look at what's been happening since, what is it, 2016, at least, perhaps before then, there's been a very clear trend towards America questioning its role in the world. We saw that in trade agreements. We saw that, of course, under Trump, but it's a much broader conversation than just Trump versus non-Trump. We saw that involving U.S. involvement in international institutions. What should the role be? Should we be involved? Should we pull ourselves out of the World Trade Organization? The conversation is extending to a new front right now, and it is the geopolitical, and it's based on the reality that America may not be able to play the same role in the world that it's played for the last 50, 70 years. If you like that role in the world, you call it Pax Americana. If you don't like it, you sort of pejoratively refer to it as America being the global policeman. But I think that the conversation that's happening in D.C. that's very animated right now is how does America stay involved in three theaters that it might have to fight in all at once? And of course, if you look at these one by one, the first one is, of course, Ukraine, where there is moderate support to stay involved, but of course, a very loud minority that wants to have nothing to do with it. There's the Middle East, in which there's moderate to high support to stay involved, but an increasingly vocal minority that's saying we need to do less, so we need to stay out of the Middle East. And then there's Asia, where there's a broad consensus that America needs to be involved, be more involved, whether it's threats around the Korean Peninsula or the South China Sea, or of course, the Taiwan Strait. But it's been the theater that we've probably been the most directly irresponsible about in terms of making sure that the military deterrence is going to Taiwan in a timely way. Right now, we're 7 years behind in terms of delivering Taiwan weapons that it's already ordered. Now, what's the sum total of all this? Since this is not a topic of the geopolitics isn't the topic, it's economics. I think what we need to take away from this is that there is a very intense conversation going on between Republicans and Democrats, between the American people, within the Republican Party, within the Democratic Party, about what America's role should be broadly in the world. And there is geopolitical and military obvious consequences from where this discussion is going, but it also has strong economic, long-term, medium-term, and long-term economic consequences for the world and how we do this. So rather than hit one country, then another country, then another country, I thought it'd be helpful to overlay sort of the macro narrative that's going on through the geopolitics in DC and across America right now. This is what the American people are dealing with. This is what people inside the Beltway are dealing with. And it's not at all clear where this is going to end up.
So Leland, that's very interesting. If there's a difference in how America will be involved globally, is there any talk of withdrawing from some of these organizations, the IMF or other agencies that have been supported for some time? Is that on the table?
I think it depends on who's president in 2025. I think that Biden is broadly a vote for continued stability in these relationships. I think Trump would like to upend some of them. It's not, maybe not IMF, maybe not World Bank. Certainly the World Trade Organizations could be in play. And so, yes, I think that this extends to how America sees itself in terms of involvement around the world. And so this is going to be a lot of the Trump versus Biden talk. We'll get into the politics and we'll get into one domestic position versus another domestic position or in traits of the personality. But the broader context of this is going to be very much a global one.
If there were some sort of withdrawal or at least backing off, is there another country that would step up? I mean, would you see interest in, say, China in playing more of a global role through some of the traditional agencies or organizations, or would it happen through a whole different set of organizations or a different way altogether?
No one country will step up, but there will be plenty of countries willing to fill the vacuum. In very specific contexts, I think China would like to step up, be more involved in setting standards for emerging technologies. They would be very happy doing that. There's others who would jump into the UN or some of these other organizations and not necessarily with an agenda, but maybe just to muck things up. And so there is no power that is going to replace the United States, and there's no power that's capable of replacing the United States in any of these forums. But there would be the absence, the vacuum created would have other secondary effects.
Are there industries that would behave differently? And what I'm thinking in particular is it would seem to me something like semiconductors would have to involve at least some of the U.S. companies, if not the U.S. directly, whereas energy more broadly defined in terms of solar production, might be sourced elsewhere. Is there any industry split that would be relevant for this question?
Well, yeah, I mean, you brought two of them up. So energy obviously is interesting, but the United States has had a huge presence in the Middle East for decades and decades because of the perceived need to make sure stability needed to be maintained in the Middle East because we needed their oil. And, there were other things there, and there are allies in the region, of course, but it was, we needed to be there for the oil. We don't need their oil anymore in the traditional sense. We're an oil exporter. So what we do in the Middle East has changed a bit. This, of course, has to do secondarily with, freedom of navigation. Do we defend do we defend the Red Sea? Do we defend supply chains through around the world with our Navy? Semiconductors you brought up too. It's something that I spend an ungodly amount of my time on because it's sort of the threshold technology to build all the other technologies that are coming. There's a problem here in terms of the way that we create policy, and I don't want to go off too much on a tangent on this, but the way we create policy around semiconductors, because there is a global chip ecosystem that has created specialties that can't easily be duplicated. And if the United States wants to keep some of the most advanced technologies away from China, it has to make sure the Dutch are on board and the Japanese are on board and the Germans are on board and some others. If you're going to war, tariff wars, if you're going to war, kinetically, then you're going to have less ability to sway some of these allies to do what you want. So right now, there's just the beginnings of a conversation going on in terms of what are we willing to give up, or what leverage do we need, and how does that affect what we do on trade or what we do militarily. It hasn't been integrated yet, but it's beginning to rise to the top as the topic du jour.
Don, sorry if I might. Leland, I found very interesting this question, this notion, the suggestion that there's a huge question around the U.S.'s role in the world. Much of it revolved around military politics. But what about capital? For instance, what are the private interests in the U.S. thinking about their involvement in terms of capital investment outside the United States of America?
I'd say there are two conversations going on at the same time. One is China specific, and one is about the role of trade and trade deficits writ large. So I think that one of the ways the international system has worked for many, many decades has been the United States as the reserve currency. It's been willing to be the lender of last resort to some extent. It's been able to run an extraordinarily large trade deficit with the world in order to provide the world with U.S. dollars. That is being rethought in some corners right now. It's not at all clear what could replace it, but the idea that that we have trade deficits with just about everyone very much bothers certain people, certain groups, and that's affecting perceived changes we need to make on the trade side, whether it's fewer free trade agreements, whether it's more tariffs. Certainly the conversations we're already starting to have about the 2025 election are about global tariffs, huge China-specific tariffs, revoking, most favored nation trading status from China or others. These are huge questions, and a lot of them go back to the idea that the United States has served this role, but that large trade deficits in some way, directly or indirectly, mean the U.S. workers being punished, and as a result, we need to undo some of this. And it's good, to the extent we do this, it could be a very painful process for the world.
Do you get the sense that trade deficit argument, which seems to be compelling to certain groups, would be robust to any data? In other words, no matter what you looked at, there seems to have been a decision made that this is the case. And I can't imagine any data that would change somebody's mind who has decided that that's how they're going to look at it. Would you agree?
Well, we have the benefit of clarity on this because we know what President Biden thinks and we know what President Trump thinks. And if they're the two candidates, then we know with certainty their perspective on this issue. At least we sort of know where Biden's coming from. We definitely know where President Trump's coming from. So yeah, this is not going to be a data-driven discussion. This is going to be built off faith.
You have time for some other questions from the audience.
If you have a question, though, for the benefit of the streaming, et cetera, we actually come to the mic, unfortunately. It'd be helpful for the recording, too.
Thank you.
Thank you. Building on that last point and points that Ms. Turner-Jones has made before, we see increasing levels of political polarization. We see declining levels of public trust in government. How do you see those affecting the economy? And on the assumption that it's not positive, what do you see that we can be doing to counter that dynamic?
You know, I get asked this question all the time. I'm in conversations about it. I'm not sure I have any good answers. I mean, the very depressing fact might be that we will only unify when we see a greater threat form, and then we forget the minor differences so that we rally against the major differences we might have with another country. But it's not at all clear. I mean, this cyclically happens in American society. It happens in every society around the world in a cyclical fashion. But I think right now there's very different perspectives on the way that we think we should be governed. And that often happens at the end of debt cycles and at the ends of certain governance cycles. So I don't think there's an answer to this question. If there was, I'd be yelling from the trees what it was.
Teresa, I just wanted to give you an opportunity if you had any additional comments on this issue generally or that question specifically.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really important question. I think Matthew's asked the question. And this is where, I mean, there are some studies done recently about this question of trust, right? And trust in institutions. And I'm not going to pick on the US in this case, and I'm going to refer to Caribbean examples. There is a general lack of trust in our institutions, and that is problematic just because given some of the difficult choices we have to make as countries trying to manage what I call very, very difficult geopolitical issues. And I would say to this question about US versus China that we know in the Caribbean, for example, there has been a discernible shift towards China, especially on the investment front. There's data, there's information, they're here, they're on the ground. They're doing the infrastructure works that previously were being done by the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank, and even CDB. The Chinese investment is here in the region, it's here in Latin America, it's all over the globe, and it's not going anywhere. Now, how is that relationship being navigated with our governments relative to this dance we have to play with being in the Western Hemisphere and within the geopolitical, for a shortcut, let me just say, Caribbean has been always fairly closely aligned with US in terms of foreign policy and rule of law, democracy. Those were all very important aspects of how this region developed just because of the integration between our economies and the US economy. So it's difficult now, given that our policymakers are saying, oh, hold on. China is kind of offering to build roads and bridges and ports and airports at a really pretty reasonable price, and they can get these projects done very quickly. We're now in, I would say, the point where our foreign policy decisions are being based on, who is delivering more on the needs that we have to have the impact on the lives of the people in the region. And that is where this becomes tricky. Clearly, culturally, I think the Caribbean is far more closely aligned with the culture coming out of the United States, especially since there's a large diaspora of Caribbean people living in the United States. We travel there, we shop there, we do a lot of our recreation there and back and forth with tourism, and Americans being a huge source market for visitors, especially in countries like the Bahamas, which are close, but also other parts of the region. So this is not a trivial point, I think, that you're making about what's really happening, but the trust piece has to be built locally. And by that, I mean our governments need to talk more, share more information, be more honest with voters about what things cost stop overpromising on projects that either they can't do because they can't finance, or tell us about the real cost of electricity. Tell us why it's so high. How come we can't do better? What are the things that we care about as citizens in this region and as Bahamians? What are those conversations that we should be having with governments that are not happening? And I think during election time, we have a lot of conversations with parties. But after parties get elected, administrations tend to forget this. And I think if you look around the world, the countries that do this best, let's take New Zealand, for example, it's a consultation, right? You're always referring to the public, to the public. You have a delivery unit. You're saying, we promise you this, and by the way, we're halfway down the road on delivering all of those roads we said we would fix. I think that's the piece that's missing in a lot of countries, is where's the accountability? And because our politicians are not magicians, they cannot create jobs if jobs aren't available. It's not politicians' job to create a job for a constituent. And those messages, I think we need to start saying clearly. And the way you do that is by sharing more information, being more transparent about the policies, giving us our fiscal responsibility reports on time, and reporting and having those conversations so that everyone is involved in the dialogue and it's not a one-way street. Matthew asked that question because he's representing a group in civil society which is basically looking at that. How can we improve governance? You improve governance by having more conversation with citizens. Get the buy-in. Difficult decisions, the only way you're going to get those through is if you actually saying to the public, hello, this is really complicated. We need your help. We can't do it alone. No government can do it alone. The government also needs the private sector to weigh in honestly on some of these conversations so that we come up with the right solutions. So, sorry, that was a long-winded response, but I think it's important to get that out there.
Thank you very much. We may have time for one more question.
One more from the audience. Yes.
Good morning. She just spoke about accountability and she made reference to the work that Matthew does. I'm a trade unionist and we do a lot of advocacy. We send recommendations. We ask for accountability, but it seems to just fall on deaf ears. What else can we do?
Having participated in this arena as an elected official, an appointed official, I like to remind people that the currency of politics is popularity. Okay? Politicians trade on popularity. The more popular they are, the richer they are. The less popular they are, the poorer they are. So every politician is mindful of the extent of his or her popularity in the voting population. So the pressure point for politicians is popularity. Not begging them, not pleading with them, but demonstrating to them how a thing done can enhance their popularity. So that means you have to do a little bit of work, research work yourself, to demonstrate the extent to which a project, an ideal, a proposal can enhance their popularity with the people that matter, who are their voters. And alternatively to say, if you ignore this data, then I shall be forced to do the kinds of things that work against your popularity. Okay? So what can you do? Study every politician's base. Everyone. They don't, just because they belong to a party doesn't mean they have the same base. Some politicians have a very local base, which despite being a minister, means that they may cease to be a minister in the next election, but their base will vote them in, nonetheless, because they're popular at the local level. So once you understand that, your conversation isn't a national conversation. Your conversation is a constituency conversation. And the extent to which your name is being spoken by their constituents about a matter you said is important and they believe is important is the extent to which the politician listens. At the national level, I like to tell people, if you have one person with a placard speaking about an issue, a politician drives straight past you. If you have 10 people, they drive straight past you, but they slow down a little bit. If 1,000 people are doing it, they stop and they say, I was always with you on this issue. So numbers matter to politics. The currency of politics is popularity, period.
It's a wonderful answer. Let me say thank you to all the panelists, and I appreciate the discussion.